The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Mr. Keatinge, thank you for your time and thank you for taking our questions. Let us start with the purpose of your visit. Why are you in Georgia? Is it your first time in Georgia? And what has this days been for you here in Georgia?
So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to make my first ever visit to Georgia. So it's exciting to be here. So the specific reason we are here is I work for a research program called the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. And we look at issues at the intersection of finance and security. Finance and security are linked, whether we talk about economic security or sanctions or money laundering. These two issues come together. So we're here together with the Regional Institute on Security Studies to look at how Georgia is dealing with the international sanctions that have been put on Russia in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
What has this international sanctions on Russia changed in terms of how we link finance and security with each other?
So the particular project that we run out of our office in Brussels is looking at how the EU is dealing with the challenge of sanctions. And it's important to remember that although sanctions have been a tool of foreign policy for the EU for many decades, it's not really until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia that sanctions have become a genuine challenge for the EU. By that I mean, because the Russian economy and the EU economy are so closely linked, when the EU makes decisions on sanctions, they obviously do also have an effect in the EU. And the EU needs to take strong steps to make sure the sanctions are properly implemented. So it's a fascinating challenge because of this close connection between the Russian economy and the EU economy, and between the connection of the EU with then regional countries like Georgia, who aren't part of the sanctions coalition but have trade relations with both the EU and with Russia. So it's a very complex situation.
Yes, what makes Georgia complex in that situation?
Just look at the map. Look at the map where Georgia sits, obviously bordering Russia with long-standing economic relations with Russia on the one hand, but at the same time on an EU accession path. So stuck in the middle between these two big economies and with some difficult decisions to make, with obviously political narrative coming from Russia, also with visits coming from Brussels. And so for Georgia, I think there are a lot of questions to think about in trying to navigate this narrow line, this tightrope between the West and Russia.
So what is your first impression? How is Georgia doing that? Because us, like Georgian citizens, we were quite confused at some time when, for example, the Prime Minister said that we are not aligning with EU sanctions, but at the same time they were, yes, and very careful in not breaching these sanctions.
I think it's very important to remember that sanctions are a political tool. So they're a political tool. What I mean by that is that countries decide whether or not they want to implement sanctions. Sanctions aren't a function of criminal law. Someone isn't guilty of something and therefore they have sanctions placed on them. And so for any government, they are going to make a political determination as to what is the right thing to say. Now, the interesting point is that many governments say one thing, but then something else happens. So let's take the current sanctions situation. It may be, and I don't follow Georgian politics closely, but it may be that the government says we're not going to align with Western sanctions. But in Georgia, there are banks, for example, who have very close connections in Europe, in London, in the United States. And if those banks don't follow the Western sanctions, then that's very bad for those banks. They will lose their connections to Europe, to London, to the United States. And that's very bad for the Georgian economy. So in a way, whatever the government said the banks were going to take a decision which was to follow the sanctions because it was in their business interest to do so. So I think we often see, I give the example of Hungary. In Hungary, you have President Orban, who is very vocally negative about sanctions, yet his government still votes for sanctions at the European Union. So sanctions are they're a political game.
You have worked for years at JP Morgan's, and you know how the finance is linked with overall security. Why is it important to be aware of the sanctions, and why is it important to play the wise game?
So you're right. And finance, the link between finance and security has, I think, become even more important in the last few years, because a few years ago, everyone thought that we'd had the end of history, that there was going to be globalization, free trade, everything was going to be beautiful. But as we've discovered, in recent years, the global economy has kind of fragmented into different blocks. And countries like Georgia have found themselves in a very tough position because they're being almost made to choose. Do you want to be with the EU? Do you want to be Russia? How do you stay in the middle? So understanding the pros and cons of decision-making around issues related to economic security is very important. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that money buys influence. And we see increasingly where countries decide that they want to influence the politics of another country. Yeah, money changes hands, people try and buy influence. So kind of understanding the finance implications on a country's security are really, really important. And one of the messages that we always try and share when we visit countries is you should think about finance as a matter of national security. Your economy is a matter of national security, and financial flows, the way finance can influence politics, is also a matter of national security if you're not careful.
In this process, there should be government, like the public sector that is well involved into these processes, and also private sector that is ready to withstand all these impacts and negative impacts, right? How would you assess Georgia in that direction?
So you're absolutely right. The private sector is critical because let's remember, the money is being moved by the private sector. The trade that is sanctioned is being moved by the private sector. And so the private sector has to be a central part of the solution. I think from what we have seen in our visit here so far is that many Georgian companies and banks, they appreciate their connections with the international markets, with international finance, with international trade. And so the decisions that they make will want to protect their business. They won't want to make decisions that damage their business. So continuing to operate with Russia as a bank, for example, or continuing to operate with sanctioned companies as a bank is very bad for your business if you want people in Frankfurt or Paris or London to trade with you. The same, we see that the EU has now started to bring forward the capability to put sanctions on companies in third countries that are facilitating sanctions evasion. So if you're sitting there as a Georgian company and you're facilitating sanctions evasion, you are probably making a choice that is going to lead you not to have the opportunity to trade with the EU anymore. Now, you might make that choice. It's your sovereign right to make that choice. But if you make that choice, then you know what the consequences are, which is, in this case, you might not be able to trade with the EU in the future.
Are only facts important? Because you are also aware how big investors think and what their logic is in doing business with such countries. Are only facts important, or also, I don't know, some perceptions of the country also? Because we have a border with Russia. Russia is our biggest neighbor. So do you think that fact also raises those doubts that Georgia might be used for the evasion of sanctions?
Yeah, so there's, in the business world, in the finance world, there's a very important phrase, which is that investors make, quote, risk-based assessments. So obviously, if a country has a border with Russia, then it's going to trade with Russia. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And therefore, if you are an investor, when you're thinking about the different risks to consider, the fact that there is a border is a risk that you will want to understand. And if the company you are investing in is a trading company, a trading goods or a logistics company, or it's making electronics, then you're going to want to understand what that company's relationship is with that border, because that border represents a risk. So, inevitably the geography of Georgia is going to be a consideration for any investor. And again, it's up to the company or the leadership of any country to decide what profile do I want to show to the world. And that's a judgment that a government and the private sector in that country is going to make.
But would you say that in that vulnerable situation for the country, it is really important that what investors hear from public officials is the same what they hear from the private sector representatives. For example, the example of this is NBG's current law, if you have been following these events, when the private sector, the banks were saying that we will stand by international sanctions. And so it seemed that NBG was giving them the choice not to do that or to do that. I mean, isn't that even more confusing in this current situation?
So the other really important word in business is certainty. And I can tell you, coming from the UK, where we had the Brexit vote, and the one thing after the Brexit vote, after the UK's decision to leave the EU, the one thing that business was always asking the government is, give us certainty, right? We might not agree with leaving the European Union, but we want certainty so we can plan. And it's the same on sanctions. You've got to have certainty, because you cannot be planning your business to go one way and to comply with certain regulations, and then the next day you go the other way. I mean, for a business, uncertainty is it's a critical problem. And again, for investors, uncertainty is a bad thing. And we see that in the UK. Uncertainty means no one wants to invest in the UK as much as they used to. So certainty is what matters, and changing your mind is uncertain.
And also, if we look at the definition of financial crime, does that change over time? I mean, with this like tech becoming almost as important as, I don't know, everything in our lives.
Yes, one of the things we look at in our program is exactly that, the way that the threats evolve over time. I mean, the problem is that the old threats still exist. People are still conducting financial crime with suitcases of cash, but they also have new options. They have cryptocurrencies, they have fintech, electronic payment companies. And so what we find is two things. First of all, that financial crime gets more complex and more sophisticated. So in other words, there are many more ways of moving dirty money around the world. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that the kind of list of threats that we need to worry about is also getting longer. It's not just people doing drugs trafficking, it's also people doing weapons trafficking or human trafficking, or it might be international fraud, or it might be sanctions evasion, or it might be people trying to influence elections with money. So the number of threats where finance plays a role has expanded enormously. So, I mean, the good news for us as researchers is there's lots and lots to look at. The bad news for the world is that the threats are just getting bigger.
Exactly. And to sum up our conversations, if we look at 2024, what would you identify as main challenges or as main priorities to watch out for?
Yeah, so we've just talked about this question of kind of complexity and sophistication of the types of financial crime. I think if we go back to the first part of our conversation, talking about sanctions, for the EU, 2023 was about implementation of sanctions. It was about really making sure that the sanctions were being implemented properly. In 2024, I think we can expect to see the EU be more assertive with enforcement. We really haven't seen any companies or individuals being punished for facilitating sanctions evasion. That's in the EU. And I also think we can perhaps expect to see the EU being a bit stronger with third countries like Georgia, like the UAE, like Turkey, like Kazakhstan, to encourage them to hopefully come alongside the EU and the EU sanctions regime. Because the EU now has tools in its 11th sanctions package from earlier this year. It has tools to take steps against companies and indeed countries that don't follow or that facilitate sanctions evasion. So I think 2024 we can expect to see a more muscular EU with the possibility of enforcement action being taken against companies and countries that facilitate circumvention and evasion.
Thank you so much for a very, very interesting interview. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.